had on Sunday morning, of all things, with our overseers. And once a year, I do a presentation to the Board of Overseers to talk about faculty development diversity and things that are happening at the university for faculty. This year, they expressly asked me to talk about cross-school activities and how we were making progress in a variety of fronts about cross-school activities. And we're just going to show a clip that I played for them to you. This is a clip from last year's second session of talking about teaching. This is what's wrong with technology. Do you know how to control the volume?
Kind of asleep.
We have a class on the Columbia Space Shuttle disaster, and we literally have students play different roles. And this, for the first time, I asked the students to cluster in groups of assigned roles to get the protagonists in character. So I gave them 5 minutes to cluster and say, if you're the shuttle manager, how would you actually have behaved in this situation? Lots of talk one another. And then we did the role play. And the simulation was almost identical to what actually happened. Wow.
Exciting. Anybody else make any shifts or changes? Yes.
So I completely changed my course. I teach a class.
This is a good thing. I know, just like that.
So I teach a class on chip design, and my class is actually quite small, so didn't need to use technology. I just scribbled different colored numbers onto postcards, gave it to everybody.
Oh.
The one concern I had when I was switching over was whether I was going to be able to cover as much material.
Yeah.
And what I found was I covered more.
Wow.
And it wasn't that difficult to change my lecture notes because I looked at each slide, thought about what point I wanted to get across, and then just turned it into a question. So it makes people think about the different answers.
Yeah.
And then when they choose the right question, when they choose the right answer, they've actually gotten the main point of that particular slide or concept. So it works quite well, I think.
Interesting.
The overseers were blown away. I played a few clips like this, and the general feeling of the overseers was, finally, Harvard is trying to operate like a university. And one of the real beauties of this session is that we have faculty from every different school represented, and we're talking about something we do in common, we're talking about teaching. So I want to thank all of you for this year's second instantiation of talking about teaching. And today we're going to have Eleanor Duckworth, my colleague in the Graduate School of Education, and Lee Warren, who you actually saw up on the screen there, has facilitated last time, is going to facilitate again today.
Yes, and it actually makes me think we should ask the same question we asked it at the second session. Did anybody change their teaching as a result of last week's session?
See, nobody in the room is an administrator.
Maybe the
I went
answer-
in and I started thanking everybody very explicitly. That was interesting. So I actually, because there was not a teaching in the same kind of exercise, I went into the office the next day, and to everybody on my team, I went up and I looked them in the eye, and I said, thank you very much for X. This is what X meant to me. That was really weird, that part. And this is what it means to the organization. So I actually used the formula. So I
Well, we'll see. Maybe we can ask next week and see what happens. It's a great honor for me to introduce Eleanor Duckworth, whom I met many years ago. She may not remember that, but of course I do, because I was meeting the great Eleanor Duckworth. And she's a professor at Ed School. I Googled her, and it turns out there's a whole long page on Wikipedia about Eleanor Duckworth. You can read a great deal about her. It starts off by saying she's a cognitive psychologist, an educational theorist, and a constructivist educator. I hope that's accurate. Anne was a student and colleague of Jean Piaget. And that she is the performing dancer. And there's a YouTube video of her getting at least a minute and a half standing ovation at the end of her last class in December. So thank you so much for doing this with us.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure for me. I'm very happy to be here. I enjoyed last week's very much. Josh isn't here, I don't think this time. I want to refer to him in a minute. So what I teach about is teaching. So it's a little complicated to teach you about teaching in a seminar about teaching. It's, so what I got into education, I had studied with Piaget and I got into education because I dropped out of graduate school and I needed a job. And the job was doing elementary school science curriculum development. And I didn't know anything about science, so everything I learned there. But my colleagues, I found that my colleagues were passionate about their subject matters, and they wanted to develop that same passion in teachers and kids. And for them to get kids and teachers interested in science, there was no point in giving them words about the physical world, physical and biological world. They wanted to find ways to give them the physical and biological world. So they spent time designing pendulum frames that could stay stable enough, or cheap enough to stay stable enough so that two pendulums could swing on it for 100 swings and not get out of sync. Or a little basket, a little cage that children could take a butterfly home overnight. And then they developed all kinds of questions also based on the materials that they devised and the things they wanted kids to understand. So it was a fantastic experience for me, and that's why I got into education. So I've learned since then the importance of teaching, putting students in touch with the subject matter itself, no matter what the subject matter, rather than words about the subject matter. So that's why I know this set of talks is called Experiential Education, and I guess that's why I fit. It's because I set out to have students experience the world, this part of the world that the professor would like them to learn about, rather than reading words about it. So my field, being teaching and learning, my course that I'm about to give you a sample of, I developed experiences in teaching and learning that would give rise to thinking about teaching and learning, push people's thoughts a little bit further. And three kinds of experiences. One is I would work with kids and they would watch me. One is they would go and work with kids the way they saw me work with kids. And one is I would put them in the position, not of kids, but of learners. Learning subject matters by being in the subject matter rather than having words about the subject matter. So that's a secondary level. I'm teaching about teaching through experiences instead of words about teaching. And to do that, I'm teaching other subject matters without words about those subject matters. So it's a little complicated. So I decided, with wise counsel from Todd here last week, to do the third of those and to try to engage you in learning something, although I'm not an expert in any other field of teaching and learning. But I can usually get people started in a number of other areas. And what I wanted to say about Josh last week was that I consider teaching not to be telling, because telling, I think, is one way of teaching wildly overused. And I consider teaching to be helping people learn, however they help people learn, however you can find out to help people learn. And last week, at one point, in his introduction, John said something about he wanted to teach people, I think it was about that way of giving feedback. And then he interrupted himself and said, no, help them learn about it. So I found that very comforting. So I'm just going to plunge in with a poem. and we will read a poem. That's the main thing we will do together. And then when we finish doing that, I'll spend a few minutes asking you how the experience was, because that's what I do. That'll be part of what I do in my class. And then Lee will take over the general discussion that you do always have. So, here's the poem. Just a minute now. I'll just put a few, and I'd like you to read it to yourself. Thanks. And for a few minutes, and then I'll ask whether we've read it, and then we'll start. And there are dictionaries. They are Harvard dictionaries, so you can't very readily pass them from hand to hand. So you'll have to get up and walk and lean over somebody, I think, to check these dictionaries. But if there's a word you'd like to see if there's 7 other meanings that you had never thought of, the dictionaries are here for you to do whatever you want with them. Does everybody have it now? Would anyone want more time? Okay. So I'd like to start talking about it by asking you simply to say something that you notice on the page. So no interpretation, or I guess it's hard to say no interpretation, but try to not interpret. Don't interpret. But whatever you notice, we could say it's in line 7, and you can point to it, and we all say, oh yeah, I see that. For example, line 7, I don't know if there's no punctuation at the end of line 7. That would be something you could say. And we can also, you can point to it and say, oh, I see that. That's the sort of thing. And then we will work up to talking about your ideas about it, but we're not going to start with talking about your ideas about it. Wendy, did you want to say something?
Well, I was just going to say the word black is capitalized.
That's exactly the kind of thing that we're yeah. Yes.
So it's sort of like a bridge. I mean, if you turn it over, there's a perfect symmetry to it.
I will feel free to call on folks because I want to make sure I hear lots of different voices.
I can't tell whether the break in the third stanza is intentional or not.
Is what?
Intentional or not.
In the third stanza, those two
The
lines?
third stanza, yeah, well, I guess so, yes. That in the next one, because
I
most
see.
of them start with capital letters, but this one seems to break after 2
I
lines and
see.
continue.
You see that? I think these bunches of lines, and he's wondering whether these two bunches
Belong together or not, yeah.
And you're calling the bunches of lines stanzas?
Yes.
Ian, what would you have to say?
It's,
Just point to something.
yes. Thank you. We're talking, just the title alone caught my eye,
Fine.
considering the topic we're talking about.
Fine, say it.
Yeah,
Say the title.
the progress report.
John? Who's that?
And I mentioned that in the fourth bunch of words talks about the hollows above the hips. It's the only thing describing a thing.
It's the, I'm sorry.
It's just a thing, a place on the body, everything else it doesn't describe.
Oh,
It's just a thing.
wow. That's interesting. Let's look and see whether anybody finds anything that does describe the body apart from that. Be the case.
There's the gurgling, which is a sound.
sorry?
There's the gurgling, which is a sound that a person makes.
Right, gurgling. That's, where is that?
In the first thing, half of that.
Christoph?
Yeah, I guess maybe with regards to symmetry, every paragraph except for that one with 2 lines has 10 or 11. So in other words, they all are the same length. But the sentences themselves are not necessarily, they can be long or short. Some of them are 1 word, some of them are several words. But the entire paragraph is either always 10 or 11 sentences, except for that one.
10 or 11 lines.
Yes, right.
Hans-Peter, how did you notice?
Well, I also noticed the 2 lines in the middle, and before somebody noticed that they might be connected to that paragraph that comes after, I actually thought they were standing completely on their own.
Okay, I'm going to toss my hand.
Okay.
I'm often not sure where to pause.
Where?
Where to pause. Sometimes I have to read twice and decide where I'm just going to stop to pause.
Would you be willing to read the whole poem out loud for us?
These days, when you do say hello, I'm never sure if you are being saucy or experimental, or really protecting some new position. Sometimes you gurgle while asleep, and I know tender places still intrigue you. Now, when you question me on love, shall I recommend a dictionary or myself? You're the child of wind and ravens I created, always my daughter. I cannot recognize the currents where you swim and dart through my loving upstream to your final place of birth, but you never tire of hearing how I crept out of my mother's house at dawn with an olive suitcase crammed with books and fraudulent letters and an unplayed guitar. Sometimes I see myself flash through your eyes in a moment caught between history and obedience. That moment grows each day before you can fly, as when did washing dishes change from privilege to chore? I watch the hollows deepen above your hips, and I wonder if I have taught you black enough, until I see all kinds of loving still intrigue you, as you grow more and more dark-brewed and tender and unafraid. What you took for granted once, you now refuse to take it all. Even I knock before I enter, the shoals of curious choices, not my own, that flood through your secret reading magnet under cover. I have not yet seen you, but I hear the pages rustle from behind closed doors.
Thank you, Mary. Could you point to a couple of places where you had trouble deciding?
So in the last stanza, the third line, even I, where it comes parsing them.
Could you read it in the two different ways? Or however many ways?
What you took for granted once, you now refuse to take it all. Even I knock before I enter. Even I knock before I enter.
Okay, thank you. Could I ask one other person to read it? Or did you want to say something first?
Just, you can also put even with the previous sentences. What you took for granted once, you now refuse to take it all either.
Would you want to read the poem aloud?
I'd like to defer.
Okay.
I just noticed something that was bothering me, and I didn't notice why it was, I couldn't figure out why it was bothering me. There's a title, there's a date, there's no author.
It has an author. It does not.
But the absence of an author
Yeah, that's
is like a violation of some set of principles.
Well, I'll make sure you have it on there before you leave today.
I had another comment,
Yes.
that, because these two lines really stand out because they're different from the other, but the intriguing thing is the word moment caught me. It's the only time that a word is repeated like that, and it stands right under each other. In a moment caught between history and obedience, that moment grows each day. So that sort of felt to me as something important.
Yes.
I noticed that the only things that are capitalized, the first letter is capitalized as either as time words these days, and sometimes now, or at first you and I as confrontation, and at last what you took for granted as an exception is more for me a conclusion.
There's sometimes, I know also in the beginning of the third stanza, sometimes is also.
Yeah, that one also,
Yeah.
because also sometimes.
Interesting.
I find at the end of the fourth stanza, it really hard to parse dark, rude, and tender, and unafraid. Is it dark, rude, and...
Yes,
I think kind of along those lines, there's several phrases which have like an odd juxtaposition of words. Like in the first stanza, line 4, protecting some new position. Usually you protect something an old position that's kind of been caught. Or the second stanza, line 6, final place of birth, right? Final place of resting often. And I circled in the same kind of thinking, dark, rude, and tender. Right? Rude and tender is like an odd juxtaposition. He grilled them both simultaneously.
Thank you.
Well, now that you mention that, I'm troubled by history and obedience as being opposites, or something to be between. I couldn't quite get that.
I was going to move on, but you've done it already very nicely, to add puzzles to your noticings. But before I go any further, I would love to have one other person read it. You willing, Anita?
Read it?
Yes.
The whole thing.
The whole thing? You had such a smiley face, I thought you were offering.
No, but I did want to add an observation, though, that when we have those very short sentences, even I knock before I enter, duplicates what one does before one knocks, which is to stop. So even I, and then knock. Because perhaps one listens to what's on the other side of the door to see if it's appropriate to knock or not. Or until I see all kinds of loving still intrigue you, again, stopping at the thought of what is it that intrigues until I see. So the the short sentences that require one to stop are a reflection of the action that continues. So, nice. All right.
Good thing. Yes.
These,
Could I suggest this time that you not read along with her, but just listen?
These days, when you do say hello, I am never sure if you're being saucy or experimental, or merely protecting some new position. Sometimes you gurgle while asleep, and I know tender places still intrigue you. Now, when you question me on love, shall I recommend a dictionary or myself? You are the child of wind and ravens I created, always my daughter. I cannot recognize the currents where you swim and dart through my loving, upstream to your final place of birth. But you never tire of hearing how I crept out of my mother's house at dawn with an olive suitcase, crammed with books and fraudulent letters and an unplayed guitar. Sometimes I see myself flash through your eyes in a moment caught between history and obedience. That moment grows each day before you comply as, when did washing the dishes change from privilege to chore? I watch the hollows deepen above your hips and wonder if I have taught you black enough until I see all kinds of loving that still intrigue you as you grow more and more dark-brewed and tender and unafraid. What you took for granted once, you now refuse to take at all. Even I, not before I enter, the shoals of furious choices, not my own, that flood through your secret reading nightly undercover. I have not yet seen you, but I hear the pages rustle from behind closed doors.
Thank you very much. So, more noticings? And if you wish, you could add in more puzzles, things that puzzle you. I'd like to try to ask people who haven't yet spoken. How about Andreas?
Yes. Something that was puzzling me is why the date is handwritten.
Why it is what?
The date is handwritten.
Handwritten. Okay, that's a puzzle. Yes.
Something that struck me is, especially in the single word and two-word lines, there's sort of a load or an expectation when you read them that you almost don't know what will come next. So when it says these days, when you start these days, you can complete that in so many different ways, often complaining or not. And then when you say now or myself, until I see, even I, there's sort of a tension when you finish those one or two words, because what comes next is almost brought into higher relief, it seems to me.
It's a sort of an extension of Benita's point also, taking further, yeah.
But I thought, on the same point, I thought when Anita read it, and you told us not to read that was much less noticeable. The choppiness on the page disappeared, it seemed to me.
Shinyu, I'm going to leave you for a minute because there might be other. Yes, James.
Just following up on the handwritten number, I was paying a lot of attention to the speckles on the page, which I think are from an older form of reproduction, or that the fact that this page has been reproduced over many years.
It wasn't scanned.
That's sort of an archival poem. Yes.
Without discussing the interpretation, I found that so much hinged on the word daughter. No matter what you take away from that, the entire poem changed dramatically when I heard that word.
We'll get to that in a minute, how that changed took place. Yes.
You know, I'm struck by how the author goes back and forth in time, sometimes even in the same sentence. So, for instance, just in the washing dishes, changing from privilege to chore, you know, to me that I was a small child, thinking it's a privilege, now it's changing to chore. The author does that so many times, it almost alternates.
Can you show a couple of other places?
You know, going from saucy and experimental to 2 lines later, gurgle while you sleep. And then the next place I noticed was, she's talking about upstream to your final place of birth. And then 2 lines later, she's talking about how at point in time maybe she as a teen crept out of her mother's house.
On the point about sort of odd juxtapositions, which a couple of you raised before, swim and dart through my loving upstream to your final place of birth. Births are not usually final. Just there are a number. That was the most noticeable place, and the other ones were noted by people before. But the word that comes at the end is not the word that you expect to be there.
How about Dan?
I guess I'm puzzled by several things, but the main thing that's puzzling me now is what are you trying to do with us?
We'll talk about that. We'll talk about that. But I'd like to
So I guess two things. One, at the level of the whole poem, I was struck by how little in my life do I do this. Like my day seems to be fast-paced and accelerated and trying to do many things, and this seems almost like a pause to think, to reflect, to, in a way that I'm just, I guess, not so used, or at least these days. And the thing that that struck me from the poem itself is the, when did washing dishes change from privilege to chore? Because I'm thinking of my 7-year-old volunteers too.
Yeah.
I'm thinking that rather than worrying that she's going to break the dishes, I should let her do it, because that's not going to last for long.
Yes.
I was trying to puzzle out whether this, it seems like a parent, it seems like a mother, but I was puzzling out whether it could have been my father.
So there have been a couple of repeats now, so it's you, yes. Is it Chu?
Yes. The first, I just found the 3 words repeatedly. First, tender and the intrigue and the love appeared in the first paragraph, also again in the 4th.
So let's find in the first paragraph where, tell us where.
Line 6.
Please,
And I know tender places still intrigue you. How can you question me on love? And then paragraph 4, line 8. All kinds of loving still intrigue you as you grow more and more dark, mood, and tender, and I am afraid.
Thanks. And when do you want to?
Yeah, I've been puzzled by the fraudulent letters. I'm dying to know what these fraudulent letters are.
The lawyer.
Actually, what I've been thinking about, well, we're not supposed to do interpretation.
Well, I'd like to move soon to some of these puzzles and what we think about them. Is there anybody else who has a noticing thing that, you're welcome to say it at any time, but yes.
I just cannot understand this part of the sentence. I watch the hollows deepen above your hips, and I wonder if I have taught you black enough. It seems to have some importance, but I don't understand the anatomy, neither do I understand the anatomy.
Okay. And anything else to notice? As I say, you're welcome to add more at any point. Lani, do you have anything to notice?
I think that hasn't been said. I thought the first paragraph was about a baby because of the gurgling while asleep. And so when I first read it, it was very confusing. As we developed it, as it developed, this was clearly not a baby.
Okay, that's good. Rose, do you want to say anything?
Anything more?
Oh, did you speak once?
I
Oh, sorry. Please stop, you did. I guess everybody has. That's great. So you're still welcome to again. But so let's take a puzzle. I'll just sort of randomly choose the history and obedience puzzle, because it's sort of right in the middle of the poem. What's the continuum between history and obedience? Is that sort of the question? How do you fit something between history and obedience? Yeah. Yeah. Do you have any thoughts about it?
I can say what both words suggest to me and maybe try to put it together, but history, I wonder whether it's the mother's history.
Yep.
And obedience is something that's her immediate concern, so maybe it's somewhere intergenerational, but I can't detect why the author used those two words rather than two that were more parallel.
Yeah, Wendy?
Yeah, I was linking those two lines with the several lines above and thinking that history meant, you know, the mother had, I do think it's a mother, it just feels like a mother to me. The mother had some history of naughtiness, and when she ran away, or tempestuousness, or something that's the opposite or dissimilar from obedience, and that's the catching between. I think it's a fabulous poem.
Anita?
To me, this poem was about liminality, a transition in stages between the girl growing up to be a teenager and the mother adjusting herself to the teenager. And so between history and obedience was her own history as a rebellious teenager, perhaps. And then her daughter at that stage of still being somewhat obedient on the cusp of beginning to find out on her own by reading behind closed doors books that her mother doesn't know about, or starting to find out about other things. So.
Yeah, I wasn't even thinking about the context of the mother's history so much, or the mother's history before the daughter arrived, but of a child's obedience grows out of the history of the parent raising the child. And so I guess I was just thinking the history in that context is, you know, childbearing, and then the obedience following that is, you know, the history of childbearing is the impetus for the child's obedience to the parent.
I actually took it differently. That was, as the child was dependent on the mother felt important and felt deeply connected to the child. That was the history. And the child was deeply connected to the mother and quote unquote obedient. And then in the cusp of becoming an adolescent, the history was still there, but not the obedience.
And the moment grows each day.
Yes.
So the whole poem was, for me, was framed the moment I read the title. So I was looking to see what progress report was. So I was interpreting the history and obedience as connected with like teaching and a progress report for a student. How much has the student learned? So there's a history of learning, and there's some expectation of obedience to the learning process, and how much progress has the student made. And then the metaphor of the mother and daughter instead of the teacher and the student.
I think we should have it read aloud again. Who would be willing to read it aloud?
These days, when you do say hello, I am never sure if you are being scary or experimental or merely protecting some new position. Sometimes you gurgle while asleep, and I know tender places still intrigue you. Now, when you question me on love, shall I recommend a dictionary or myself? You are the child of wind and ravens I created, always my daughter. I cannot recognize the currents where you swim and dart, through my loving, upstream to your final place of birth. But you never tire of hearing how I crept out of my mother's house at dawn with an olive suitcase, crammed with books and fraudulent letters, and an unplayed guitar. Sometimes I see myself flash through your eyes in a moment caught between history and obedience, That moment grows each day before you comply, as when washing dishes. As when did washing dishes change from privilege to chore? I watch the hollows deepen above your hips and wonder if I have taught you black enough until I see all kinds of loving still intrigue you as you grow more and more dark, rude, and tender, and unafraid. What you took for granted once, you now refuse to take at all. Even I knock before I enter the shoals of furious choices, not my own, that flood through your secret reading nightly undercover. I have not yet seen you, but I hear the pages rustle from behind closed doors.
Thank you very much. Did you notice more things or get more puzzles in the reading or thoughts about your puzzles?
Listening to Rob read it, and part of it is we've now looked at this so long, longer than I think I've paused on a poem in years. Just the act of close reading of a poem is sort of, I think that's a little bit what Dan was saying, why are you doing this? But setting that aside, I heard it differently. I heard it as the progress of, it starts out about birth and her child, but it seems to me much more about the potentials of leaving home. And her story of leaving home and creeping out under night in front of the papers, but upstream to your final place of birth seems to be when she leaves home and leaves her mom and then starts her life. And there's several pieces of that. I haven't seen you, your secret reading nightly undercover. I haven't seen you read the pages rustling behind closed doors. It's all about the next, it reads now to me in a way that it did not read at all to me, as about what will happen when she leaves her mother, as opposed to what I read originally was about what was happening in the house. And it's only when Rob read it. So there was something about what you did that processed it for me differently.
The first time I heard it, I was thinking that to my loving upstream, your final place of birth, that she's describing when you were born, which happened just after I stuck out of my mother's house. But now, after listening to you, I think that there's probably a lot more time between the two, and so it's through my loving experiences up until the time that you were born. So I don't see them as being joined the way I did the first time.
Yeah.
I'm sort of struck by a couple of things. One, this thing about the hollows deepen above your hips, so you can really get a sense of some young woman changing into a teenager, but then the mother giving out this warning, if it's a mother, wonder if I've taught you black enough, like black, what is that, like some black parts of life. And when I've heard it read, black or darker parts of life, again, what keeps coming through to me is a whole concept of love. You know, it starts out in the first paragraph and her daughter learning how to love, you know, loving still intrigues you. You know, what is it like for this parent as their daughter is evolving to take on loving too, and how does that reflect back to their love? So as I've heard it read a few more times, it struck me more about this whole theme of love getting echoed.
And where did the black fit in to that?
Well, what struck me about the black was that as your kid is getting ready to go out there and love other people other than you, you're worried about what's going to happen. You know, black usually connotes dark, you know, scary. It's something maybe negative, but dark, or, you know, she comes back to later, dark, rude, tender. It's all mixed up there. So has she taught you about those things you have to be careful of? I mean, that's how it struck me, sort of, ooh, did she teach her the things she needs to know to protect herself?
I assumed that she was a black child, an African-American child, and that the mother was wondering if she's taught her how to protect herself well enough and honor herself enough as a black person before she goes off into the world, into this world of love and
when I heard it read again, I thought I had maybe an explanation for the mystery of the fraudulent letters. It sort of sounded to me all of a sudden that this mother, if it's a mother, maybe was misled by some letters of a lover and left under, some pretenses of that lover, and just left home, and then that love fell apart, and maybe she's alone now. So I made this whole story up in my mind. The unplayed guitar, that sort of conjures hippies, and I don't know, it sort of seemed to me.
I'd like to see that. I should have, I was assuming you were going to continue on the topic we were just on, so I should have said that I'd like to do that for a while, and then we'll come back to Claudio later. Is there anybody else who has anything to say about the, yes?
I feel like now I understand the title better, the progress report. The second paragraph, she talked about how you never tired of hearing how I crept out of my mother's house. Apparently left, and then secretly. And then the last paragraph is, I haven't yet seen you, I hear the pages from the behind the closed doors. I think now it makes sense. I think she did make progress. She's doing exactly what she learned.
Okay. That's sort of in support of Judy's reading, right? Yeah. I'd still like to pursue what we were talking about just before. What Rose brought attention to black and then we commented. Did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, sure. So I was, in the various iterations of the post-reading, I'm going back and forth between being the person, the parent, and being someone kind of distanced from the person. So my reading of the black was being the person, and thinking, boy, I can empathize with this person. I mean, my kids are brown. They're dating, brown, black, white. So that's what she's talking about here. It's like, until I see all kinds of loving still intrigue you. So I read that as race and ethnicity and as a parent.
Any other comments on those two lines there? Okay, yeah.
Well, I mean, it's not so much of those. I have to say, I'm sort of obsessing a little bit on the moment caught between history and obedience. It's the one that's really puzzling to me. Because the sense I'm getting from this now, especially after I did the reading again, is that history is repeating itself. That essentially what she experienced, she's seeing her daughter experience. And I'm trying to understand this moment caught between history and obedience. It's more a matter of her seeing her own personal history return once again through her daughter and her sort of acceptance of that, which in some ways might have been in contradiction to obedience, since it seems as if she left home, she snuck out at night. With the fraudulent letters and the unplayed guitar. I think that juxtaposition is, I think, crucial because, the unplayed guitar is another sort of wish that went unfulfilled, almost. And so I'm wondering if it really is just a cycle, that she's actually seeing her daughter do exactly, or go through exactly what she did. And it's not clear to me how she feels about that.
Does that extend your thinking about how to...
Yes, absolutely. I had a similar feeling that this was history repeating itself somehow.
And Mark?
I guess one comment, returning to the if I have taught you black enough. The next line, that fear of whether or not she has been taught to be black enough, or about being black enough, it seems to be abated by, until I see all kinds of love still intrigue you. And then I don't know, then I wonder if black does mean fear again. The fear of, in other words, it seems like that concern is, if it's being attenuated by seeing that the child is capable of love and is intrigued by love, makes it seem less racial to me all of a sudden, and it makes it seem like a fear again, just an unformed fear.
Were you trying to say something?
I wasn't, but I'll mention now that we're talking about black, there's the word ravens in an earlier part of the poem.
And are they ravens I created, or just ravens I created you?
Did you find a way to connect the ravens with the capital V?
No. I was
No.
wondering why ravens wouldn't be capitalized, actually.
Oh.
If that were meant to be some kind of connection. So, no, I'm totally puzzled.
Does anybody else have thoughts about that?
Not to the point about black, different
No.
observation.
Or the ravens?
No.
Anybody got anything about that? And then there was Todd and then you, John.
Well, I was going to pick up on a point that John made earlier. Robert's reading of it sounded very convincing to me. And so I'm back to wondering why everybody's assuming this is a woman.
Oh.
Everybody's assuming what?
That the writer, that I is a woman.
My observation was about the pace, or the writers can sort of confused in every section, but there's the water gets progressively more turbulent. There's a little gurgle. In this one, then they wash it. Then there's shoals.
Show us these lines here.
I'm sorry. So in the fifth line it says you gurgle. So there's a little bit of water coming out. In the fourth line of the next paragraph, the current's where you swim. Now you're swimming and learning. And then it moves into washing dishes, which usually is lots of times more violent than swimming. And then finally, there's this concept of shoals. The shoals are furious choice. So it's a lot different to see your daughter sit there in the bed and gurgle and watch her navigate the shoals of furious choice as she tries. There's some kind of current happening here. So
Right, that's
the water images get more and more disquieting.
Maybe that's the progress
Could easily.
from baby.
What were you saying to Lonnie?
No, I was just, when you were saying shoals, not my own, that flood through your secret reading, just to emphasize your point. Two lines after shoals.
Yeah. And Rose, you were saying?
Well, then picking up on what you're saying, gurgle to me reminds you of a baby. I mean, getting back to the title, progress report, so that's like a baby, and by the time we get down here, you're into somebody in a turbulent place making choices, you know, a little kid washing dishes, obedient, and then you get down to the end where you're a person making the shoals of life kind of turbulent choices, so maybe that's the progress.
Yes.
Each stanza begins with early childhood and ends with with an older time. So it begins with or has a reference to the early and later years, each one. So it repeats that. Well, so the gurgling, and then when you question me on love, shall I recommend a dictionary or myself? So baby to grown up, and then child of wind and ravens to then talking about her as making a parallel with her teenager years. Then, which then she says, I reiterated when she says, sometimes I see myself flash through your eyes. So she's seeing herself now retrospectively in her daughter, right? So the moment of compliance, washing dishes, to then growing to being rude and tender and unafraid. So again, from early to later. And then what you took for granted once, so early, to then reading behind closed doors late. So there's a kind of repetition of time frame in every paragraph.
Except that in the first paragraph, it starts with these days when you say, well, I'm never sure if you're saucy or
Right.
So it starts in the present.
That's the one where it goes old, young, old, or old, teenager.
I think, yes, I'm working towards an end.
Yes, the more I think about it and sort of reread it, the more I'm seeing more things about the history of either the father or the mother, in that it seems as if the history of this individual is perhaps more tumultuous than I realized at first. So for example, the line, "You are the child of wind and ravens I created." I think of wind and ravens as sort of like birds flying in front of the storm. To me, there's like a storm sort of analogy to it, and it makes one wonder I mean, there's no hint here of the other partner that produced the child. And this sort of, the guitar being unplayed, the fraudulent letters, sneaking out at night makes you wonder what sort of happened there. And then to me, what I also find quite interesting is the follow-up from Black. I think it's really where, maybe it's me over-interpreting, but I think that's where sexuality comes into it. The choice of dark, rude, and tender, there's a sort of, to me, a sexual charge to that, which you don't see elsewhere in the poem. And so I think it's speaking to perhaps the age of the child and sort of a budding sexuality, which I think is a sort of an interesting element. And the juxtaposition with Black and chaos and storm, perhaps, is interesting as well.
Yeah, just following what Rob just said, I was noticing the same sort of vein in Shoals of Furious choices, which to me are adult choices, choices that a teenager has to make around sexuality and other issues like that. So that.
Well, it's getting interesting, but I think we have to stop. There's lots remains to plumb in here, I think you may agree. But I'd like one last reading, and I'll just listen to and enjoy. Yes, thanks.
Progress report. These days when you do say hello, I'm never sure if you're being saucy or experimental or merely protecting some new position. Sometimes you gurgle while asleep and I know tender places to intrigue you. Now when you question me on love, shall I recommend a dictionary or myself? You are the child of wind and ravens I created, always my daughter. I cannot recognize the currents where you swim and dart through my loving upstream to your final place of birth. But you never tire of hearing how I crept out of my mother's house at dawn with an olive suitcase crammed with books and fraudulent letters and an unplayed guitar. Sometimes I see myself flash through your eyes in a moment caught between history and obedience. That moment grows each day before you comply, as when did washing dishes change from privilege to chore? I watch the hollows deepen above your hips and wonder if I have taught you Black enough until I see all kinds of lovings to intrigue you. As you grow more and more dark, rude, and tender, and unafraid. What you took for granted once, you now refuse to take at all. Even I knock before I enter the shoals of furious choices, not my own, that flood through your secret reading nightly undercover. I have not yet seen you, but I hear the pages rustle from behind closed doors.
Thank you very much. So there's plenty of puzzles still fit to wonderful rich discussion. So I'd like just for a few minutes to check in with how that experience was for you. We know a little bit for Dan. It's a long time since he had such a restful time. But I don't know whether you appreciate it. Did you appreciate that or not?
Yeah, no, I did. I do have to say, I was thinking how the kind of writing that I do today is so different from here. For an hour we were discussing different interpretations of what's written here, and I'm sort of trained to write so clearly that there's only one interpretation. Exactly. If there are two, I've done a bad job, and it seems like here it's the reverse, right? So leave open for all of us to take from the poem what we want.
And to give it to each other.
Yeah.
So I'd like, did you want to say something, Mark?
I'm just very impressed with the mood that you created in this room by hardly saying anything really, but just opening people up to their thoughts. I'm used to being in faculty meetings with some of these people. This is the highest degree of tenderness I've ever
Yes.
I had a similar reaction. I very much enjoyed watching us uncover things together, but then I thought, how how does one decide which piece of writing to have a group like this look at for an hour? Because it's not, I'm not trained, it's not apparent to me that this particular piece would be that interesting to discover together.
Yeah, well, that is a very good question, and it's a good, it's a job for anybody wanting to teach. It depends upon the learners saying what they're thinking about. And poems are brought to my attention by people who know lots of poems. I'm quite a late comer to appreciate, maybe 20 years to appreciating poems, but I always thought, you know, the question for me in school always was, what is the meaning of this poem? And it's about the question made me feel the stupidest of any other question. Somebody smart wrote that poem, I don't know what. So I have friends who read and write poems, and former students and current students who bring them to my attention. And this one has always proved to give a good discussion. I know that some of the keys are to find poems in which words, fancy words aren't the issue. The images are it's the images and the puzzles, really. It looks simple, it's easy to read, but you see there's a lot more than you thought, sort of like that.
Well, what I was struck by was how you started it. I mean, most of the time when I've been in a class, like you were saying, it's like, well, what did the poem mean to you? And what I was struck by is you purposely said, let's not go there. Let's sort of take this apart in a different way. So just look at it and what are the puzzles? What are the things that don't make sense? What do you notice about patterns? So we started from a totally different kind of place. So it was almost like unwrapping a package in a different way, like looking at the ribbon first before you got inside, and maybe how did the packaging look and how was it wrapped. And it was sort of a slower process. And what I found, what happened besides engaging people, is that it caused me, anyway, to keep looking back at the poem again, because the first time I read it, I didn't know what was going on. But that kind of unwrapping and engaging was really different than just jumping right in. It seemed to enable people to come at it, no matter if you didn't have any ideas, you could figure out what's a puzzle. What doesn't make sense to you?
So, 3 thoughts. One thing, 1 hour. I know in my own teaching I'm very tempted to say, this is a very complicated subject. I've spent a lot of time learning about this. And you only have 13 weeks with me, and thus, like, we're going to use our time as efficiently as possible. 1 poem, 1 hour. And I sort of slowly learned over time that that is a very valuable mode, and that students really appreciate the chance to really unpack something. I will say that it was hard for me because very broadly I tend to think whole to part rather than part to whole. Everybody knows those terms. Part to whole start with the concrete, move out to the broader interpretation. Whole to part start with the interpretation, look at the details.
And what's your mode?
What's that?
Which one is your mode?
The latter, whole to part. And so it was really difficult for me at the beginning to sort of start with tiny noticings. My brain was like, until I have some big frame for what's going on here, it's hard for me to make sense. Like, we can talk about particular lines all day, but they don't mean anything to me. And then I was sort of surprised to discover that over the course of the hour, those things did in fact add up, and eventually I could see the whole. And then once I had the whole, I could go back to the specifics, and a lot of things that had puzzled me before then made more sense.
So something that really intrigued me, and I really enjoyed this, is that when I discovered in the beginning that it was a poem, I thought, well, how will this apply to the teaching of science? I mean, it couldn't be sort of more different. But in fact, it wasn't, in that I think for students, you know, when they come to science, they think there's all of this language that I need to know. I need to know the language, I need to know the vernacular before I can begin to unpack what this thing means. And so I think quite often we overemphasize them learning the language, you know, before they can really talk about the ideas. What was interesting here is that I think the same is true in terms of close reading and analysis of poetry. There's a universe of language, you know, that can be applied to this. But you started us off with, don't think about interpretation, just observe, and what do you observe, and what do you think about that? What does that mean to you? And science is very much sort of about observation as well. And so one thing I really liked, in fact, I found an enormous sort of commonality in terms of, one could throw out sort of a concept or a challenge or sort of an issue that we're trying to understand and have students take it apart just based on fundamental questions that they have or things, that they've observed, and then build to perhaps the language, if necessary, to really describe it. So I was really intrigued by that. Don't worry about the interpretation, don't worry about the language, just what are you looking at, what do you observe, and that really sort of lowered the anxiety, lowered the, I really don't have the language. I actually I've taken a course in poetry in so many years, I'm afraid to think about it. So how did that work now? How did close reading work? I was trying to remember that, and I could just let all of that go and just look at it and observe. And I think in science, that's really something we don't have them do enough of, which is just look at it. What are you seeing, and what do you get from that?
Louis Agassiz things.
Yes.
Yes.
The fish.
Did you want to say something, Wendy?
Yeah, I was struggling a little bit with your point. I teach a practice class that only meets once a week, which means there are only 12 weeks. And much as I loved what we did today, and I would love to be able to do it, I can just imagine my students saying, what the heck did we, how do you get, in other words, we wanted to be here. We wanted to learn from you. We wanted to learn a technique, and we enjoyed it. But when you get a group of students in a room who have a specific expectation about what they're going to take from these 2 hours in this week, how do you get them in the same mellow mode that we were in, and not to resist and say, I actually had a student in PSW who said we move too slowly, and this is a class that moves at the speed of light. So how do you manage that expectation and get the students in the mood to do this?
That's a good question. At this point in my teaching here, people are willing to give me a lot of leeway because they've heard about it. Just hang in there, you'll find it's okay. But a lot of them go kind of crazy the first few weeks. But there was a first time, and I think it was because things were intriguing, minute by minute, sort of. They were interested in teaching and learning, and they were having experiences unlike any that they'd ever had in the field of teaching and learning, and so they were willing to hang in there and see where on earth this might possibly lead. I think that's not much of an answer,
but the answer is, I think about it, might go back to, I don't know if it was John or someone over here said, the choice of the problem or the piece that you present is probably a big part of the answer.
It's which is curriculum, essentially. It's what do you give them, what part of your subject matter do you put them in direct contact with to take it?
So the question might be, Wendy, how do you, could you teach what you're teaching by using one example and have it blossom, and a different example each week and have it blossom, right? Because I think we learn about more than just the poem. I mean, it's an interesting question. Could you do it in your law class?
What did you mean by that, Lee?
Well, we learned about how to read a poem, for example. We learned about how to ask questions about, I did, how to ask questions about, well, we should ask everybody what they heard. That's just about what I learned, but, so we did learn about progress report. We still don't know who wrote it. We presumably will at some point.
John, you wanted to say?
I was sort of in the tips and tricks mode around the selection of the material that sort of teaches itself would be important, but the pace didn't have to be as contemplated. You could have people go back and forth, but the idea that you unpack the thing by observing it and walk bit by bit and start people in with something that anybody can observe. There's 45 lines or something. And then it's really hard to do what Eleanor did and not respond to all of our comments. The last thing that I try and do when the students are skeptical is make them wrap it up at the end and say, what were the insights, what were the takeaways, rather than you do it. It's just customer management. You have them say, here's what I learned. And they walk out of the room happy. We're all pre-loaded for that. You can get them to go around the room and say, here's what I took away from that conversation, and then they...
Or you can write it for themselves. If there's
Or
not
have
time to
them
go around.
write to yourself the
Yeah.
top 2 or 3 takeaways, then they know they were takeaways. So the pace can be different, and they can get their own takeaways, but the choice of something that actually can engender an hour-long conversation between people with really disparate backgrounds, that's hard.
Well, I'm trying to relate this to, I know a number of us do case teaching, and that sort of sets up this kind of conversation, but there's always a right answer about each of the subtopics, and especially when there are different points of view that have been stated. I sort of view my role at some point is to say, here's the right answer. So I'm intrigued with how to avoid that, or whether one should try to avoid it.
Now that you're there, ask her who wrote the poem and what she thinks.
Well, let me
I'd just like to know, what the gender and color was.
No, we could do that right away, but let me not avoid your question first. What was it again? It was...
when there is a right answer, how do you impart, when and where do you impart it, and what's an otherwise open free flow?
I usually... well, first of all, as far as teaching and learning is concerned, they read what I've written, so they have my answers to many things by reading what I've written. Gets troubling when they try to carry it out each week with the kids that they work with, kids or adults that they work with, and then so the interaction between reading what I've said about it and why to do this and how, and watching me, and then trying it themselves and trying to get results. It keeps generating more and more questions, and the answers that are all there in words don't work, except in terms of experiences you're having when you can make them work for yourself. So that's an answer as far as a practice goes, if it's really a practice we're talking about. Things that you can look up on the internet, I can't stop people going looking up on the internet. Though there's one thing we do. I think I'm rambling. I'm tempted to turn to Susan here. Who told me she took this course many years ago.
I was thinking, as you were saying all these things, yes, I was extremely impatient for the first week or so, saying, where are we going? And we're just sitting here looking at, we were counting beans, I think. Literally. There was a map.
Permutations.
Yeah, permutations. So I just remember there was a map that we had to work with one another and really very closely observe what questions were asked and how we each tried to figure this puzzle out. And I do know, full disclosure, I'm a high school teacher by profession, so I do know when I ventured into the classroom, it was difficult to try to think about how does this apply to high school biology teaching, and where can I slow things down enough so we can take some time to have kids look closely and unpack something. And I do remember doing that in particular with, I think we were looking at, evolution of homologous structures, how different vertebrate limbs were put together. And so instead of giving the kids the answer, I do remember presenting them with pictures, various things to look at, and saying, okay, what do you notice? And trying to do little bits of it. I wasn't always successful, but it was really higher.
So the press of time is certainly a factor at every level. But let me just say the main thing I like to say about it is often hard not to say the answer. It's often, but you can also get better at finding other ways to respond to the question. But what I've found almost universally is as soon as you say what you think the answer is, thinking stops. Everything stops. So that's very good motivation to not do that as you do this more and more and more.
So it's more important to have people thinking than to have the right answer.
That's what I think, yeah. Because the right answer is never the end anyway. It's the answer to this whole thing, but there's all that still to talk about.
So I'd like to ask you a question. I thought having the poem read several times was incredibly effective, but I wondered how you decided when you wanted to have it read.
That's a good question. I don't think I have very, it's a little bit not well thought out, actually. The first time was, was Tamara, right? Because she said she could see different ways to read one line. And in fact, until she said that, I'd forgotten that I wanted to ask someone to read it. And so, but that was the perfect time to have the first person read it. And then I usually have someone else read it right away, so there's two readings on the floor. But the conversation went somewhere else, so it took me a while to get back to it. And then I think there were two others, right? There were four altogether. One at the very end, just as we stopped. So it's only the third one that needs a question. That was, and I don't know what prompted me at that moment. I think we were getting into the puzzles, and I wanted you to listen to one reading with the puzzles in mind. I think that was it. Yeah.
No, is it interesting? I've been focusing on my learning. And so I've been sitting here sort of trying to be metacognitive. And this so doesn't play to my strength that it's a good exercise to be a learner again in something that is so foreign from what I do. So just that sort of sense of, okay, I've got to do this. I dreaded this stuff in high school, college, and now I've got to do it in front of my colleagues. Higher pressure. And what I was struck by was several of the things, the techniques you used, or abstracting techniques, are easy things for us to do because I'm not unlike my students in my class because I'm the expert at what I do. I'm not this expert. So it's this sense of being asked to do something that you're not an expert. You opened with a very easy task. All the stuff that was hard, you took off the table. You said you couldn't even offer an answer for the hard thing. So all of a sudden my blood pressure went down. Totally distinct when Todd last year taught a case, and I introduced him, and stupidly said I always wanted to go to law school. So as soon as he searched the classroom for somebody to present the facts of the case, there I was, and my blood pressure went through the roof. My blood pressure was just like, gee, this is really comfortable. So you set an atmosphere of learning that is very powerful for people, some of whom do know each other, some of whom don't know each other, but are willing to venture in topics that are far beyond their ken. And then you didn't ask for answers, you asked for questions. So then you said to everybody, what puzzles you here? What are some of the questions, which I thought was sort of like, are we going to get to the answer? Sort of thing, I think. But these were very clever devices, because as people were saying things, it was like, I didn't think of that, I didn't think of that, and all of that kind of thing. So you set a classroom atmosphere that was conducive to learning. So I found myself saying, well, how can I do this? And I thought, oh, I don't know that I can do it in a group this large, but I could imagine having small groups being given I teach statistics, being given a data set, not every week, because there actually are facts they need to learn, but giving them a task that was, all right, go at it, you've got some computers, and see almost do the same thing. All right, what do you see? And then having different people say things, and what are some of the puzzles? What might be going on here? And the kind of questioning, it doesn't have to be a poem, it can be some other object.
One student was a junior high math teacher, and in the article I sent you, they do a poem early on in the semester, then they go and find some people to do it with, and they're the leader, trying to get people to get engaged in it. And she had a terrible time doing that. She hated doing that. But in her classroom at that same time, she was trying to teach mixed numbers. Remember what they are? They have a whole number and a fraction, 3 2/3 or something. So, and she had 2 full lessons so far, trying to tell them about mixed numbers, and they were getting absolutely nowhere at all. But she, after doing the poem thing, she put all kinds of stuff on the blackboard of mixed number equations, all kinds of things, and greater than and less than equations. And the kids figured out everything she'd been trying to tell them for the last 2 seconds.
Because she said, what do you notice?
Yeah, she said, what do you notice? That's right. And they figured it all out, how to make sense of all those numbers, and that was all they needed to know about. So it's exactly what you're thinking. Did you have your hand up while we looked hard? No, you're okay? Yeah.
Picking up on Judy's comment, I too wondered this exercise. And in some ways, actually, I think it does embody what we all experience when we enter the classroom, because a room of different experts, so are our students, but they need to learn how to learn in this new subject matter. And I felt like you accomplished that with poetically, if I may say. And I could imagine that this is sort of, as you were speaking, Judy, that this is a way of actually promoting, learning how to be a learner in the various subjects that we teach. And at a minimum, a way to actually open up a course and to learn about, the poetry of science, if I may borrow from Rob's earlier comments, the poetry of the law and everything else. So that's one of the takeaways I got from this.
I should say that in my classes there are, of course, English teachers and biology teachers who are doing this at the same time. And when I'm doing permutations, there are math teachers and history teachers. So it's another level of difficulty, which puts a lot of burden on what you choose to offer. So and it also, the main thing is that that using the right language doesn't get anywhere. I usually ask people to say whatever they need to say without using those technical terms. So people who know a lot about poetry often start with using the literature language about figures of speech and metaphors and hyperbole and stuff like that. And so they have to stop and say in ordinary language so everybody knows what they're saying. Because the ideas are not necessarily complicated, but the words can cover the ideas. And similarly in math, there's my favorite exercise where I don't allow them to use any numbers. So I have to get the logic of what's going on here. And they can use their numbers in their heads. I can't stop them doing that, but to enter the conversation, they have to put it in terms that aren't numbers. So that's one way I handle differences.
I have a question about that, because you said this before also, to choose something without fancy words, but with images and with puzzles. Why did you start with these props with the dictionary? I was expecting fancy words.
Well, there are always people, there's no one today, I think there were prohibited dictionaries there, but did you use something?
I did.
What did you look up? What did you look?
Looked gurgle
And
toll.
And shovel?
Shovel.
Yeah.
And Russell.
And Russell. So there are often people in my classes, as in yours, who are not native speakers of English, and that's one thing. But also, there are meanings, unusual meanings in dictionaries that give you another angle that you might not have thought of otherwise. Yeah.
So, I was fascinated with your technique in terms of, first of all, discovering what, in this case, your learners, your students thought about without structuring it so much that you have no idea where they are. But I do want to come back to Judy's question on the contrast between what you did today and what Todd did last semester. Because in some way, today, frankly, I felt like I could depart from what was happening here and there would be no consequences. With Todd, I felt like, I'm better be ready here. And not only that, but I think it affects not only what happens in the classroom, but it affects how we prepare for the class. Like, it's almost like today I felt everything goes. And while I think it's great to explore sort of a new discipline, I'm a little bit confused as to how we can sort of demand our students to learn with a technique that seems to me more exploratory. I'm not saying it doesn't have a place in the learning of our students, but rather to use this almost exclusively seems to me like, I don't know, it's in contrast with the way I think about some of these issues.
Does anybody have anything to say to that?
I heard you say you had a life-changing experience today with regard to the way you see your 7-year-old. So I'm amazed that that was either an insincere thought or that it's already been forgotten.
See, here's the issue though. Was this what she was trying to achieve with me?
I would argue that she was having maybe a different goal with everyone in this room.
Yeah, but if I'm teaching statistics and someone leaves the room saying, oh, I've changed my perspective on how I view whatever, my 7-year-old, I'm like, well, that's great, but that's not what I'm here
So, for those of you who weren't here last year, I taught a highly Socratic law school class at some school. And I would say this, Dan, I think that what I did has the disadvantage that the structuring of the problem is done by the teacher. And if you think that that's the single hardest kind of thing to do, then the most advanced thing that's happening in the classroom is the teacher's thinking and not the students' thinking. I was sitting here thinking that this more open-ended thing maybe encouraged the students to do the most advanced thinking of generating hypotheses and generating classroom. So I'm not shy about what I do, but I'm not sure that it's always the best thing to do for the teacher to structure.
And Joe?
Well, I wanted to connect this to the discussion earlier about right answers. And I feel like one of the, so it's easy to say that this is essentially sort of an English discipline, and thus, sure, like there are a number of interpretations, and some may be more or less well-founded in the text, but we are sort of used to thinking of English as a discipline where there is no sort of really right answer. There are people who are more and less knowledgeable about making interpretations. But I feel like one of the big barriers to trying to do this kind of teaching in other disciplines is this notion, that we're sort of delaying getting to the right answer, and B, that we have a lot of content to cover, and that this is a sort of non-time efficient way of doing this. And I think that we should talk about that a little bit. I don't agree with that perspective, but I think it would be worth surfacing, because I think it's a large barrier to whether or not someone would actually adopt something like this or not. And I think the key is the point that you made, which is that in the sciences at least, it's a sort of investigative mode. It's a sort of falsification epistemology. So you demonstrate truth by showing the falsity of the previous claims and thus people get into the sciences for real in college and graduate school and beyond because they want to investigate something which is unknown. And I feel like when we present the sciences to people who are starting out, we sort of say, well, Darwin came up with this, and this is the way the world, Newton came up with that, and this is the way the world works, and you need to know it if you're going to function in the sciences. But that's not really the kind of essence of the scientific spirit. So I would argue that sort of across a sort of wider range of fields than we think, to Todd's last point, the really advanced work is the work of exploring something which is unknown, trying to offer an interpretation and then tying it to evidence, and then having that critiqued within a sort of social environment to see how all that holds up. And to the degree that we can get students to participate in that process, we are essentially accelerating them to the most advanced kind of learning they can do, which obviously doesn't mean that you don't need to know a lot of things to be able to make decent interpretations about complicated things.
And some of what's unknown is what's unknown to the students as opposed to what's unknown to people. Somebody's hand is up there, yeah.
I just want to share something when I was a student at Harvard School of Public Health some years ago, and in the context that I'm not good in statistics or math. So I was very concerned about taking a statistics course. It was Marge Stroblet, I don't know if anybody knew her, but anyway, she did a very interesting thing. She did her usual lecture teaching, and this is to say you can do things in different ways, but for the test, she would give us the data of what the questions would be, but she wouldn't tell us what the questions were. So what happened was, she just gave us this data. which is like you giving a poem, and we would sit with groups of us, would spend hours going over the data and saying, what kind of questions could she ask? So what happened was, there was more learning that happened rather than study questions per se, because and that's really what you do in science. You have to think of the questions. You're presented with a natural happening. You have to think of the questions. That's the real case-based teaching is a situation, and you think of the questions rather than being given the questions and then you having to answer it. So getting back to how with science, I mean, here was somebody who was really straight shooter, straight statistics kind of person, and yet I thought that was one of the best learning experiences I had at Harvard School of Public Health during that time, and I tried to think of ways I can sort of create that. So I sort of thought that was sort of what you sort of did here a little bit. You just threw it out in a way, but anyway, I throw that out as a way for the scientists to think about how we could create study groups and things like that.
So we're coming up against our clock. Rob, you wanted to say something?
Right, so, I mean, I have to say that I wish I had had this session a week ago. because I just spent a week teaching a very complicated process that explains how cells divide and when they know how to divide. And I started off with sort of the complexity of it, and then at several spots I would say, so that explains this simple part, that explains, you know why this happens. When I wish I had just shown them a cell dividing in time-lapse video and had them unpack the questions, which they would then answer. So I think, though, to speak to the issue of content, when is there time to actually uncover the content, I'm less concerned about that personally, because once again, that basic idea that is the lecture time, is your time with the students, the time to cover the language and the vernacular? Or in fact, is it more appropriate for them to read that sort of outside of class and come to it ready with the language, or even afterwards, perhaps, which is something that we've tried in another course. But there is one thing I am concerned about, and I think Judy alluded to this, scale. So my class is 100 students. And one thing I really liked is that, and sort of speaking to Dan's comment that, he could have checked out. You actually didn't allow us to check out. You made it quite clear that all of us had to say something, right? And so, in a class of 100 or even 50, you can't have everyone say something. So is this something where it only works in a small group?
My classes are about 50.
50?
Yeah. And the biggest class is in 65. And I did a poem once with a faculty at another university, but I think there were 120 all just sitting around in a circle. And we went around the circle that time, and the first 15 or 20 said what they noticed. The next ones were allowed to add what puzzled them. And the next ones were allowed to start to say what they thought about the puzzles. And so each person spoke only once. But it was fascinating.
Okay.
Fascinating.
We're just, Lonnie?
Yeah, we don't have to talk about it now, but I thought that something that Judy said about her reaction to being Socrated last year, it is something we should put on the table in terms of when people learn. Do they learn when they are being stimulated to the point of being anxious, or do they learn when they're feeling calm and have a more meditative voice, and they can consult with the person sitting next to them before they respond? We don't have to talk about it, but I do think that that's a really important element of learning.
Yeah. So we do have to end. I hope that we start the next session with a question that did anybody change how they were teaching this week and the intervening week. And do you want to tell us who the author?
Yes, I'm about to do that. The poem is Audre Lorde. Audre Lorde.
Who is black?
I don't know if she is. I would love to have you, if you would, write her name on your copy so they don't circulate without her name on it.
So you are Crystal and not telling us, so that we're wondering who we are now.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
You're purposeful in not telling
Yeah,
us.
it was
that.
because if you do know the poet, sometimes you lay that on the poem and don't look at the poem so well.
And thank you so much. What a
You're so
great
welcome.
experience for us.
I didn't get to ask the discomfort. I don't know if people who didn't enjoy it felt free to say that they didn't enjoy it, which I can take. But or even some parts that felt a little stressful or unproductive, or so. I just like to say I would usually do that. We don't need to do it right now. I think that's the important part of it also.
Judy, where do we meet next week?
In the Pedagogical theater.